Hi, this is Paul. Yesterday I started a commentary on this video and maybe today I'll finish it. I had two randos conversations this morning and I had a conversation with Josiah, not online. Actually, Josiah's conversation was in person. Who's Josiah? Some of you know Josiah from the Friday morning Bridges of Meaning question and answer. Josiah is a church planter here in Sacramento. He's doing a residency at one of our daughter churches, and the poor guy has the world's worst luck in terms of timing as a church planter, because one of the things that so before I did videos or anything, I was involved with church planting here in Sacramento. And one of the things that we recommend church planters do is have a lot of conversations with people. Why? Because it's the only way to know what's going on. Before making this video, I just ran out and got a little snack because I was getting a little hungry, and put on the Teenagers episode of Tom Holland, Dominic Sandbrook's The Rest is History. And about 2/3 into it, they're talking about teenagers, and of course, Tom Holland has one. And Tom Holland has this moment where he sort of pauses and realizes that, oh, no, are we doing history or are we doing reflections from my home? And if I start talking about my teenage daughter here on the podcast, don't cross the streams. But it gets into, and right at that moment, he had this question of, he didn't have it, but I had it in that moment listening to him, which is usually the kinds of things we have. I often tell people that you don't really hear the sermon I'm preaching. You hear the sermon in your head that my sermon provokes. But what is the relationship between teenagers in general and his teenager? And that very much gets into this question of history, a universal history. And thinking about this video more, all of us, in a sense, have a universal to us. It's the history we bring to the world, but the question of a universal history is something that coheres in order to keep a community together. One of the randos conversations I had this morning, which he didn't want it to be recorded, so obviously there's no recording to share with you. I obviously only share recordings with randos when the randos agree to sharing it. But we talked about Christianity and this trend of and you can see this among various people on my channel. People who say, well, I can't really believe that stuff. And of course, believing things in a propositional way is a big piece of the Protestant Reformation. And in a way, that was one of the ways that they could organize the battle between Protestants and Roman Catholics. They could list what they did and didn't believe in. And this is a very old practice, of course. It's a way to sort of create lines between us and to have you on one side and me on another. And a lot of people are on the other side of believing, yet in church, well, what is that? Again, I didn't play any of, but I noted Tammy Peterson's talk about practice. And it's very interesting when you look at the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis project, Religion That's Not a Religion, Rafe Kelly. There's a lot of talk of practice. If you would go to, there's a lot of talk of practice in the general church community. Pete Vanderbeek, who is a colleague of mine and a friend of mine via CRC Voices, that listserv that I mention every now and then, Pete has started making his own commentary videos, and he's making commentary videos on, he made a little bit of commentary on Tim Keller and Rick Warren. Both of those are mega church pastors. And today he had a little bit of commentary on James K.A. Smith, who also he's a professor of philosophy at Calvin University, my alma mater, who has been talking a lot about practice. And this is sort of the real, that's what I think they're talking about it because of the advances in cognitive science that basically show that Our beliefs are in many ways formed and shaped by our practice. And it's sort of the elephant and the rider. If you want to shape the elephant, don't bother talking to it. Change its path, change its practice, and you can reshape the elephant. This comes all the way back around to the conversation with the first rando this morning that, again, was not recorded, where we talked about, so we had a friend who doesn't, atheist sort, doesn't believe in God, but then went into a 12-step program and is finding the community enriching. And, well, 12-step programs have long been a gateway drug for churches. Why? Because once you use that practice to sort of sort out whatever it is that is causing trouble in your life, like alcohol, if you decide you want to apply this practice and you want to have something of a community, and you do in fact want to move forward, well, churches are just sort of all around you. But how are churches formed? Well, confessional churches after the Reformation, and before the Reformation too, organized themselves via beliefs. But any pastor who actually pays attention and listens to his flock knows that that's what's anywhere between 30 and 60% true. It's the human relationships, it's the routines, it's the rhythms, it's the way things are done. Bishop Barron, in his first conversation with Jordan Peterson, made the comment, I think, where he said, you could always sort of tell a cradle Catholic 50 years ago because when they went into a movie theater, they engaged in certain Roman Catholic practices, forgetting they were in a movie theater. It's that built into them. Now this conversation, as I started talking about it yesterday, very much gets at the question of heaven and earth. And story, just like us, is sort of this nexus point between heaven and earth. And what we've been working on with the question of modern history is trying to put our hand over one eye, only see the physical, and learn something by that practice, this practice that escaped the laboratory. So let's jump back in where we left off and keep going.
It's also worth kind of pointing out here. So the Sibylline oracles are they're sort of part prophecy, part history, but the two things are so interwoven that you can't actually separate them.
Yeah.
And part of being able to understand the idea of a universal history is being able to also understand it in terms of apocalypse. Like these two things always go together. I mean, we've talked a lot about this particular volume from.
Now, that's really interesting because, well, what does he mean by apocalypse? Well, you find apocalypse in Daniel's chapter 7 and forward. You find the most famous apocalypse is in the book of Revelation. There are various ancient apocalyptic texts. Well, what is apocalypse? Well, in some ways, apocalypse is where symbolism is no longer lurking beneath the layer, but comes fully manifest out. And that's why people, back on the psychedelic thing, which I'm amazed how. I'm amazed at I really appreciate all the comments that you people contribute. If I were a good YouTuber, I'd tell you to like the video because apparently that's what recommends it to more people. And that's why, YouTubers are always like and subscribe. Because I guess if you like it, and Rick, on Fridays, Rick is like, we have to remember to tell the people to like it so more people come. It's like, okay, well, more people, I don't know if more people necessarily helps the conversation all the time, but see, I just distracted myself again. Where was I going with this? Apocalypse. Oh yeah, the psychedelic conversation. So fascinating. I understand the Christians and some people on couple of people on Twitter. Pageau made a comment on my Substack on Twitter about my Substack about psychedelics. Pretty negative, and just fascinating people's responses to that. My take on it is sort of, I don't know, I won't share it because that's going to take us down a whole number. Let's go back to Apocalypse. From
the Dumbarton Oaks Medieval Library, which I have a lot of on the shelf over here. So this connects two works. One is the Apocalypse of Pseudomethodius, and the other one is an Alexandrian World Chronicle. So the Apocalypse of Pseudomethodius is basically like dealing with the whole idea of after the Roman Empire. Well, it's really sort of like dealing with the story of the rise of Islam, right? So after the Roman Empire has come, has Christianized, has established peace, why then are bad things happening?
I'm going to have to look this up and check it out. I am deeply interested in that, because one of the things lurking beneath what's going on in the Christian world right now is in some ways a reenactment of the divisions that came about after the success of the Union in the American Civil War. You had a post-millennial tribe that believed that, well, now we have science and religion will converge, and together science and religion will converge into kingdom come here in the world. And post-millennialism, the terminology isn't helpful for a lot of people, because post-millennial and premillennial or amillennial always sort of hinges on the interpretation of the millennium that you can find in the book of Revelation. Millennium meaning Christ's rule on earth for 1,000 years, millennia, 1,000 years. And obviously 1,000 years is a symbolic number, but of course, partly because of the modernist fundamentalist fight, fundamentalists had to take it all literally, so it has to be 1,000 years. Kind of the destruction of symbolism in its wake, which is ironic for someone that wants to look at literary, look at it in terms of what is written. But I've been very interested in eschatological questions lately, because there's a weird inversion going on where progressives on one hand have a great deal of optimism that through changing society, through legislation, through social pressure, usually social pressure, stigma, I mean, all of these things that 20 years ago were sort of labeled as regressive. Through these things, the world can be perfected, yet many of those people also hold quite apocalyptic notions about environmental catastrophe, things of that nature. I mean, they're the ones that keep spinning out certain apocalyptic future scenarios. And then you've got, on the other side, although it's not the eschatological beliefs of American fundamentalists, let's say, are not highlighted like they were, let's say, 20, 30 years ago with the rise of the Left Behind book series and movies, a much more pessimistic take on the world, where things are going to get darker and darker and grimmer, and then Jesus breaks in and you have the end of history. So that's sort of the two strains that have been the two eschatological, theological strains that have been possessing the American imagination. But there's weird inconsistencies and incongruities with them, because the people who should be premillennial, the ones who are expecting a catastrophe, are also the ones who, they're not, capitalism should make things better, technology, we should give technology a free hand, we should, for the most part, let business, do its thing. And so there's, both sides have on one hand a surface level posture, which is almost the inversion of their second level posture. So the progressives sort of believe that with human effort we'll arrive at this great utopia, but at the same time we're having dreams of an apocalyptic dystopian world. And then the conservatives are, oh, things are getting bad and bad. That's the surface level. But beneath, well, we're going to keep working our Calvinism and our capitalism and our technology and the political process. And, but even another layer under that is many of them are deeply pessimistic about the future because they think, well, we've lost the sex war, we've lost the culture war, we're losing to the other side politically, on and on and on and on. So the inversions of these two sides are really quite fascinating. All of that to get me into one of the things that I want to take a closer look at is Constantine, because Constantine continues to come up as a really interesting figure. This came through in the comment section. Constantine was, for Julian, who has been on the channel, made a comment, Constantine for Anabaptists and certain Protestants has long been sort of the end of the good church era. But from a perspective of, let's say, the Eastern Empire, it's sort of the rise of kingdom come. And now you see this utopianism as a recurring theme within Christianity. A long time ago, I did a conversation with a guy who wanted to talk about the original plans for South Haven, Connecticut, where Yale University is. The Pilgrims and the English separatists and dissenters who went over to the American colonies intended to establish God's kingdom on earth. This was a big theme in the Swiss Reformation, where the question of the monasteries had been a failure, and so therefore they were going to make the whole city holy. This question of how do you process the rise of Islam is a very interesting one for the Orthodox Church, because Islam ate the lands where many of the Orthodox were. Orthodoxy didn't stand up and prevail against Islam. Now, I'm not trying to play tribal games here. Catholicism has taken one heck of a beating in Europe, and the American religious situation is a whole nother thing. So this question, it doesn't surprise me that a move into apocalyptic would be something that happens when you're confronted with a catastrophe. And the catastrophe would be, well, wasn't the kingdom supposed to come with the new world capital of Constantinople? Wasn't that kingdom come? How are we supposed to think about this?
Didn't we like, to put it in Arthurian terms, like, didn't we find the Grail? Like, shouldn't things be good now? Like, what's going on? And
this is a continual struggle in Christianity, because this always thinking you're on the verge of arriving but never getting there. And for me, in my own theology, this gets into much more of my two-age theology, where you have the current age of decay. And part of the way that I understand Jesus is that in the present age, the revelation of the Son of God and Son of Man will look like it looked in Jesus. So there will be an antithesis happening. But can kingdom come, and under what terms? And I think this gets into the question of many of those who are sort of looking at Christianity curiously, skeptically, and wondering, would this work, or would this work for me? So the YouTube algorithm dished up for me this video on deflate. And it was about Peterson, the Peterson-Barron conversation. And I was curious about it. And he sort of played the Peterson clip about the church doesn't demand enough of its people, and that's why it's losing people. And I thought, that's partly it. Now, Peterson really much more emphasizes the adventure, that the church should do more of selling the adventure. And adventure isn't just making demands on people. I immediately thought of Nathan Ormond, who has been on the channel a couple of times and was kicked off the Discord for poor behavior. But I like Nathan, and I know some of the people are less patient with Nathan, but I like Nathan. And of course, Nathan, made some videos about becoming a Christian because of Jordan Peterson, and then he told the story on my channel not too long ago, and then things didn't really go very well with his local church. They were in some respects asking and demanding things of him he didn't want to do, and so, well, you leave, because we're not living in a medieval theocratic society where the church has the political mechanisms to enforce its belief and practices on people who don't wish to participate. And so he left. And so this idea that, well, people are leaving the church, and if the church would only be more demanding, no, it's not just demand. The church has to give a compelling vision, and the church has to instantiate it and give people a track to follow. And it is pull push in many ways, as Peterson has with his future authoring program. But this, of course, touches on the eschatological question of, well, why would Christianity lose? And to, perhaps against my better judgment, to once again reinstigate. You might have to turn your sound down a little bit. To once again reinstigate this question of kingdom come. How does the church instantiate enough realization to ignite the imagination and motivate us on towards sacrifice in an age where all our dreams are only half fulfilled, still in the age of decay?
The Alexandrian World Chronicle is another work from roughly the same period that is basically just a very straightforward blow-by-blow universal history of the world. In fact, if you want an easy introduction to a universal history, you could do a whole lot worse than the Alexandrian World Chronicle.
I'm going to check it out.
But the fact that these two things were just included in the same volume is a wonderful sort of symbolism happens moment. Because the two texts are not, related in that they were from the same author, but they are of a piece, right? That ancient peoples understand. You have to understand history to understand apocalypse, and vice versa, right? Because the history is, here's the way that the pattern manifested itself before us. This is where we're from. This is how we fit into the story. But then the apocalypse is that same thing looking forward.
Yeah.
And that's a really interesting observation. And again, one of the things on our list about having to figure out how to talk about and think about and work through is, in fact, of course, the relationship between a mythology and a modernist history. And I don't say mythology as made up stuff. I say mythology as a history functioning deeply in our map, in which we participate in Petersonian words, telling us how to act.
Right. And even, so I grew up in basically the same kind of culture that you did, right? Fundamentalist, Baptist, evangelical, right?
And this is fascinating. Who would have imagined that the children, and these, I would guess that both of these men, their parents were not Easter and Christmas Christians. Their parents were deep into it, and, well, now they're in Orthodoxy. That's not incidental, apostle of purpose. It's not incidental. Something is happening in this.
And so you'll know that there's a deep obsession in that culture with the end times, with the Book of Revelation, etc. And of course, one of the things, now this may not have been an issue for you because you're from the land of Canada, I think. I think that's how you guys say it, Canada.
The land of, I'm actually not. I'm from the land of Quebecia.
Quebecia, okay,
we don't
all right.
identify.
The people who got traded away after the 7 Years' War for Martinique.
With those other
Okay,
people.
yeah. But in America, in American evangelical culture, there's a deep obsession with trying to find the nation of America in the Book of Revelation. It's really important that
Pageau laughs. She's serious. It's really important.
Americans, and like,
I've got bad news for you. If it's there, it's the whore. He's like, okay, stop.
I don't disagree with you, but it's like,
and of course, you know, see, and this is where, gosh, am I going to get into her book? This is where Jesus and John Wayne sort of doesn't fully get the, you know, for a while I was a little curious about what's going on with the COVID stuff. And so the John MacArthur stuff was going on in Edmonton in Southern California. And so I was watching some videos that was doing some commentary on that. And so that dished up a video to me about John MacArthur talking about America. Now, it's funny because there's a two-part thing that happens there. America is both God's chosen people, or God's, it's sort of a Cyrus figure. God's, more than that, it's God's principal tool for the salvation of the world. Okay, that's deeply post-millennial after the Civil War. And I read some of that stuff from George Marsden's Fundamentalism in American Culture. That's a deep thread running. But then the fundamentalist against the modernist continues to cast America as a rebellious nation that should be God's chosen instrument, but is falling from the path. And this is part of what happens in the narrative after the counterculture, especially. And so then in some ways, the two political parties sort of take the two poles of Satan and the zealous people. Fascinating how this stuff works through. Of course, Pageau's on the sideline, so he can just look at it and laugh. They lost the 7 Years' War, and so they got traded away to the British Empire.
So a good example of this would be there's this moment when the virgin who bears the child, is it the church or is it Mary? I mean, it's both. It's not hard, people. It's both.
Yeah.
But anyway, she's borne up on the wings of an eagle to a safe place, and so they will say the wings of the eagle is the United States Air Force.
Oh my goodness!
I have sat in.
Stop.
Like I mean, part of my story too is I was a Baptist pastor before I became Orthodox, and
this is fascinating.
And so I've sat in theology classes where they were teaching eschatology, and that's what they said in the class, that the wings of the eagle are the United States Air Force carrying the chosen people of God to safety.
And what always amazed me is, well, isn't that symbolism?
So see, there it is. America is part of the story. Now that's...
And America has to be part of the story. They're going to get into this in terms of getting the map of the nations. You find that in the book of Genesis. These maps, these histories are mapping the world so anyone can participate. But with a modernist approach to the Bible, you can't map America into the past. Now look at the Mormon origin stories. And what's interesting is that in the 18th century American church, a lot of these ideas that sort of got brought in through Mormonism and continued through Mormonism, they were out there in the water and they get picked up. But America has to, and so in terms of the Latter-day Saints, America gets written into the story. I remember visiting Salt Lake City for the first time, and they have, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has a lot of things that you can go and look at. And my impression was, this is the most American religion I can imagine. America is brought into the story. Now, again, people might stand outside of that and scoff and point fingers and tisk at them. But this is part of my critique of Christian Dumay's book, Jesus and John Wayne, that it's awfully ungenerous because people have to map, and they're going to map. And sometimes they map in opposition to, but sometimes they map in agreement with. And I think, as Pageau makes clear in his parasitic storytelling, the opposition to mapping has a fundamental problem if there's no bigger story underneath. And that's part of the reason in the Christian story, creation is originally good and then rebels, because that puts the goodness at the bottom layer. Joy is foundational, rebellion is derivative. And that's deeply important, because if your foundation is rebellion, what if you win? You're stuck.
And you wonder why there are so many atheists. Like, you just wonder.
So it's okay, but it's wacky, yes, but it's actually also a pretty normal impulse.
Yeah.
To try and find what's your place in the pattern, like in the story that's being told, in the pattern that's manifesting, like, where do my people fit in?
Yeah.
And that's kind of what a universal history is about, and part of the loss that we've had as a result of the loss of the medieval model. Part of the loss that we felt has been not having a universal story that we can plug ourselves into, and so that's actually been replaced. We think we're so cosmopolitan, but it's actually been replaced by much more parochial narratives.
Yeah.
Like the sort of evangelical American conservative narrative, is America's the new Israel, or like even things like the 1619 Project. I don't know if you're
Their desire to restate the origin, right. To find a way ideologically.
Those are ways of doing mythology, but they're not universal. They don't actually, they're actually ironically deeply non-inclusive.
Yeah. Right? And so the way that I kind of see it, and I think that you pointing to the apocalypse and to the, let's say, legendary history, there's something about, so just in terms of experience. So you can imagine we have your moment, like the moment in which you live, and that moment is you have access to a certain granularity to that moment if you want to, right? You can kind of access the details of this moment, okay? But the more you go forward and the further you go back in both directions,
yes,
the more you move towards pattern, right? And that just will happen normally, because in order for you to remember things from a very long time ago, they have to synthesize into patterns. And in order for you to talk about something that hasn't happened yet, but that is following that pattern, then you also have to use images that are universal enough, for them to then find body in the future.
And I think that's really helpful, because it helps understand apocalypse. And take the book of Revelation or the last half of the book of Daniel, where the creatures and the figures are so dramatic as opposite history, because history is the patterns, is spirit, is the spirits clothed in flesh and bone. So Rick has been playing around with Unreal 3D engine for the, because he's always trying to make things better, for the Friday morning question and answer. And so he was showing me some of that Unreal Engine, which is a gaming engine, and basically talked about you get this sort of humanoid form that you skin, and you can skin it as just about anything you want. And so history is sort of, well, the patterns are seen as skinned, but in the future, they're sort of unclothed. Apocalypse is Greek for revelation, which is why the book is in the singular, not the plural. But it's unclothed, and so in a sense, what you're trying to see are the spirits themselves. But of course, spirit is like wind. You can't see wind. So they're archetypal in that sense, the archetypos. And so that's why they look so dramatic. Now, tomorrow is Ascension Day, and this Sunday is Ascension Sunday, and I am preaching on the Ascension. And C.S. Lewis says the ascension of Jesus is an element of the story that C.S. Lewis pays a lot of attention to in his book Miracles. Partly because it's sort of, in so many ways, it's a liminal transition. Jesus rising into the sky, being hidden by a cloud, is in a sense, it's symbolic, it's apocalyptic, it's all of those things. Now, C.S. Lewis, in his book, has to deal with the, let's call it, theoretical snobbery of our world that looks upon stories like that dismissively. And Lewis, in Miracles, on one hand, acknowledges that these are representations, defends them by saying these are powerful representations that actually communicate far better than your abstract speech, which itself is littered with representations because you can't speak in any other way but through metaphor, even in your abstraction. And so what you're probably going to be left with is the stories themselves, because that's the best way to articulate the relationships that the story is attempting to communicate.
Future, and it's like if I said something like, "I'm gonna die," right? I'm gonna meet death one day. It's like I'm talking in patterns. I don't know how. I don't know, but I know because I understand the pattern of life that this is going to happen, and so I'm predicting it. But I'm not saying that I'm going to get this disease or that I'm going to be this age or, so as you move towards the future, you move in patterns. And so that can help us understand why the legendary history, both the story in Genesis, why it's so patterned and why it looks like the end of Revelation with the heavenly Jerusalem. And
the recognition of the pattern, I'll pull, for me in seminary, again, a lot of this other approach to the scripture in the modernist frame was deeply unhelpful for church-going Christians because it attempted to strip all the pattern out and look at it in a way that we could not assimilate. And then, of course, someone like Robert Alter comes in and reads the Bible as literature. Peterson talks to Robert Griffin, about, Northrop Frye, because that helped Peterson begin to understand how the Bible was speaking. And for me, when I was, learning about the Bible in seminary, Robert Alter and his methods, which were all about pattern, chiastic structures, type scenes. You have these patriarchs meeting women at wells. And I think in my seminary days, the assumption was, well, they're just sort of elevated literarily. And of course, it's Peterson that will come along and say, but you know, a well isn't just a place to get water. A well isn't the spigot on the side of the church where you get water. There's a functional relationship between a spigot and a well, but there are other layers to a well that the spigot does not have. And those layers are, in fact, are important and contribute to the story and contribute to the ideas of why patriarchs meet potential wives at a well. And now jump ahead to the Gospel of John. I sort of made a few people upset in my Sunday school lesson when I started bringing in these themes into that story, because Jesus is meeting a woman at a well, and any person steeped in the Old Testament in the book of Genesis and the book of Exodus would have known right away, this is where patriarchs find their wives. So this woman that Jesus meets, she's someone turned me on to a new channel. I got to share it with you. Yeah, you know who you are. You did it in the comment section. Kevin Samuels. I watched 2 or 3 of these videos, and I thought, you know, our little bridges of meaning conversations about the marriage crisis. This dude, your average at best video, 1.5 million views, where, oh, there's so many layers to this. You know, this is sort of a black Stefan Molyneux focusing directly on the mating, dating scene, because here women call, and he's telling this woman that, you know, the way you look at your age, the fact that you have a 13-year-old son with a sketchy father, lowers your status in the marriage market. There's a truth, okay? There's a truth that arises. How do you represent that truth? What is the symbolism of that truth? So how did I get here? Jesus and the woman at the well. Jesus meets this woman at the well, and this is not Laban's hotter daughter. This woman has had 5 husbands, and the one she's living with now isn't her husband. And she's sassy. I love John 4 with Jesus and the woman at the well. It's one of my favorite chapters. So many of the characters in the Gospel of John are just so vivid. The man born blind and how he engages in that conversation is just so vivid. And what happens there is the woman doesn't become a wife to Jesus, but the woman becomes an evangelist for Jesus. And through this woman who has a sexually suspect past, who is in many ways damaged goods, becomes the apostle of Jesus to this Samaritan village. It's just a powerful, powerful story. But Kevin Samuels, that was something else. I get a lot from you folks when you share stuff. It's always worth it going through the comment section.
And why the prophecies of Ezekiel are talk about paradise and the mountain of precious stones and all of this type of imagery, because it's both. Like, there is this extreme in the past and the future of how you can actually see the pattern more easily when you look at things that are very far away in both directions, let's say. And so in the universal history, that's something that happened. And so one of the elements of the universal history is trying to trace all peoples back to Noah.
Right.
And the way that they would do it was almost like through ontology, through the characteristics of the people to a certain extent. So there would be like their place in the world geographically, but there would also be like an understanding of the characteristics of the people. So a good example that I like to use, which seems arbitrary, is that the Hungarians see themselves as descendants of Nimrod. And you think, like, how could you ever prove that? You can't prove anything like that. Like, this is obviously not, but there's something about their, so you can imagine.
You know, he's not, far be it from me, because I just did it right now, far be it from me to criticize Jonathan for that. He's not finishing sentence. You know, how can you have a descendant of Nimrod? And what's happening in Jonathan's head is he's doing, he's looking over his left shoulder, because modernity is saying it didn't happen. It didn't happen. It didn't really happen. And in a sense, what this universal history is doing is acting as a mythology and says, well, regardless of where you got the genetics from, this is what's going on, and this is how the pattern will lay out. And of course, modernity comes back and says, but yeah, the physical layer is important too, and the physical layer contributes too. And that's why, you know, what we're working on now is in many ways a continuation of the project that the medievals did. But these processes for those Canadians and Quebecois, those processes are deep. They take communities of people. They take centuries to work through. And that's what we're doing.
Imagine when the Hungarians converted, then they tried to unite themselves with the biblical story, with the Christian story.
Right.
And then in their characteristics, they're like, oh, we're nomads, we're hunters, we live, you know, this is how our ancestors lived. And therefore connecting it to Nimrod, who was this giant, as also because the Hungarians are kind of ogre-like, you know, like even in their own, the way that they that's why the ogres are actually Hungarians, you know. Like I think some people think that the word ogre comes from like a same root as Hungarian.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And so this idea that they have giant ancestors and that they were these hunters and everything. And so this is not even like people saying it about them.
Right.
Which is because there's a negative aspect to that. Like being a descendant of Nimrod is not like necessarily all positive. But it's like recognizing yourself and your place in the story, and then understanding that aspect can also be converted and participate in the, you know, in the universal salvation.
Yes.
And now there's that word salvation. You got to really watch that word salvation, because when Jonathan says it, now these two former Baptists are gonna, okay, what do you mean by that word? And that's part of what we're working through here is, and participation in the consummation and the renewal of all things, okay? Which is different from going to heaven when you die. Going to heaven when you die is sort of a way of saying it, but it's a reduction. And I'm using other words that try to expand it so that, because in Christianity you don't have Jesus escaping from his body and floating up to heaven, you have resurrection. So the point is that physicality participates in the renewal of all things, which is why Jesus rises from the dead. He doesn't just pop around as a ghost.
So yeah, you have to connect yourself back to Noah. This is even sort of there even in Scandinavian folklore and mythology. You know, as those people Christianized, they look back at their ancestors, and one of the things that they try to figure out was, where do we fit in? And actually, this sort of thing has been going on ever since the Gospel according to St. Luke. You know, when Luke writes his Gospel,
it's been going on a lot longer than that.
So there's the genealogy in Matthew's Gospel, which goes back to Abraham, right? The genealogy in Luke's Gospel goes all the way back to Adam. And the point of this is that Christ has come not as the savior just of the Jewish people, but as the universal savior, right? So that there's a place you can can trace your lineage back, right? And this is what Luke is basically encouraging his Gentile, his primarily Hellenic readers to do, is to figure out where their story joins the line of Adam, which, you know, theoretically that should be everyone, right? So figure out where their story joins the line of Adam, because Christ is the new Adam. So he's going to actually assume or sort of recapitulate all of that stuff back into himself.
Recapitulate. The word just sort of slides out, but just recapitulate. It's to take everything and that he be the head of. Read the book of Colossians.
And that's really where this begins in the Christian story. And then, of course, it goes on to manifest itself in some really dramatic ways with one of my favorite historical figures, who we'll talk about in a minute. So, yeah.
Pageau's like, did I miss a memo?
I thought it would be.
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I want to get to basically, again, so we grew up in the same kind of subculture, right? So I don't know if people blamed everything on Constantine.
Oh yeah, so we're moving towards Constantine. That's where
we're moving towards Constantine. Yeah.
Well, before we get to Constantine, we need Troy.
Yes. Okay.
The two sources are really Noah.
Yes.
And then Troy. And so tell us more about why is it that everybody's connecting themselves to Troy, and even just tell us how they are, because it's pretty amazing.
So let me talk about the Scandinavian peoples, because this will get both Noah and Troy in there, right? So the Scandinavian peoples have this culture hero. He's called Shield, or Sheev, or sometimes like those are, some sources those are two different people, and then in like the Beowulf poem they're combined into one. It's Shield Shaving, which is basically Shield, son of Sheaf. So it's the same character, right? Mm-hmm. So the idea is that and what these Christian monks, writing in the frozen north. Actually, it wasn't that frozen. There was a warming period, so they were growing grapevines in England at that time. But anyway, these Christian monks writing in Northern Europe would actually tie him back and say, Sheev was a son of Noah who was actually conceived and born on the ark. There's actually a bunch of really wild medieval legends about a fourth son of Noah who was born on the ark. And actually there's some in here, so please buy this book, people. This is a super cool book. There's some in here, and sometimes like it's a pretty monstrous thing.
I'm a light touch for book buying, dude,
but actually
I'm gonna shop while I'm watching.
That monstrousness, right? That's part of the story of the Scandinavian peoples, especially as they first interacted with the Roman world. So they sort of tied themselves back to Noah via this sort of fourth son who was maybe born on the ark. And then others, you say it was through the line of Japheth, who actually, if you look at those the divisions, so a lot of people try to take what's called the Table of Nations in Genesis, right? So these 70 nations that descend from Noah's three sons, who are divided up after the Tower of Babel. And what they would do is they would try to map those onto the nations that live in the world today. And the crazy thing is that they mostly get it right. They get it more right than they get it wrong, because what they basically end up doing is mapping the three sons of Noah to the three major linguistic groups of the ancient world. It's almost perfect, actually. So what you end up getting is most of the people who they believe to be descended from Japheth are speakers of Indo-European languages. So it's from a philological standpoint, it's actually pretty interesting.
And it's very interesting that, of course, they didn't have access to genetics, but it follows language.
And so
they see themselves as maybe born out of this monstrous fourth child.
Maybe born out of this monstrous fourth child who was born on the ark. So you can think about the symbolism of like, he's not born on solid ground, right?
He's born in between worlds. Like he's born
in between
figure, right?
Yeah. And even in Beowulf, he's a liminal figure because he shows up. He just washes ashore during this interregnum period that the Danes have. So their previous king was bad and he's gone, and they don't have a king now. And so they've lost their culture. They've lost technology, right? And then Sheev comes to them and brings about this renewal of the Danish people and kind of founds this mythical Danish court, which is basically the Danish equivalent, the Scandinavian equivalent of the Arthurian story. So he's this, and actually Arthur's got that same sort of half monstrous element in his story, which
does Alexander. Alexander has that too, in the legend at least, because he's the son of an Egyptian priest posing as an Egyptian god. So he's like he's a bastard figure. A lot of these founders, because they're intermediary, like they bridge two worlds. They're represented mythologically as half human, half snake sometimes, they have different in every culture. You always have the first king often is a giant or a monster or some kind of a hybrid figure because he's in kind of in between worlds, really.
Yeah. So then the other part of this is Troy. So Troy is, I would say, a full half of the master story of medieval civilization, East and West, right? And the story of Troy, I mean, is deeply important. It's one of the stories that if you haven't read Homer, and then you kind of, I mean, it's hard to even know where to begin. And the fun thing is that actually a lot of people in the Middle Ages hadn't read Homer, but they, especially in the West, they didn't have Homer until pretty late.
And this interests me because when I first listened to this, I thought, well, it's because of Homer. But you can turn it around and say, no, Homer wrote it because it was Troy. And then again, back to the sort of the Jordan Peterson psychological, where he's playing in this realm, he'd say, well, what about Troy makes it Troy and gives it this position that connects up all of these mythologies?
But they had Virgil.
Yeah, they had the Aeneid.
Yeah, they had the Aeneid. So in the Aeneid, what we see happening is the origin story of the Roman people, and specifically of the Julian family, right, where Julius Caesar comes from, and literally every Caesar after him, because even if you're not born into the Julian family, to become Caesar, you have to be adopted by the previous Caesar. Obviously there were coups and things like that, but that was the normative way that things happened. So you could say every Caesar was in a sense part of the family of Julius Caesar, right? Caesar is a family name before it's a title.
Yeah.
So this is not a new story that Virgil is writing down. This was already the self-understanding of the Julian family and of some of the other major families of Rome, was that they were descended from the mythical, basically the exiles, the people who lost the Trojan War. They're the descendants of the losers, right? But the Trojan War is not how do I say this? It's not if you read Homer, there's no right side.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
a truly epic story in the sense that it shows all the sides, and you can actually see the story from the different sides.
Yeah, it's a deeply complex work. It's a deeply complex work, and so they, even though they were the losing side, they were still seen as belonging to this older, more beautiful world.
Yeah,
and so to tie back to that is a way of tying back to the. You could cynically say it's a form of political legitimacy, but it's more than that. It's they're already trying to tie themselves back into the older story of their culture, right? And so what you have happening by the Middle Ages is that almost every culture, and I'll give Father Andrew a little shout out here, because he recently discovered that actually the Lithuanians and Father Andrew's been sort of recently reconnecting with his Lithuanian heritage. The Lithuanians also have this story that their civilization was founded by refugees from Troy. So what you have by the time of the Middle,
again, that is just fascinating. You have, you think about Abraham. Abraham, his civilization, the civilization he founds, he's in some ways a refugee from Ur. So you have these patterns that keep coming up.
Middle Ages is every major culture has somewhere in their story, somewhere in their founding story, this idea that they go back to Troy. They'll have, and usually they'll, not always, but usually this will be somehow tied into Aeneas's family. Because then what that does is it connects you with both the old world, and by the old world I mean like the really old, like the Hellenic Persian world, but then it also connects you to Rome, and all of the things that Rome brings with it.
There's something about the Aeneid too that people need to understand, is that the Aeneid was seen in many medieval strains as being somewhat prophetic, because the prophecies about let's say the pronouncement that Virgil makes about Augustus Caesar were interpreted by the medieval scholars as ultimately talking about Christ. It's like almost as if Virgil didn't know, but the things he was saying were really ultimately referring to to Christ, because Augustus was seen as this kind of son of God figure. It's like the medieval people said the real son of God that he was talking about without even knowing was Christ.
And the interesting thing is, it's not even so much Augustus as it is Augustus's son who dies in childhood, right? So the prophecy, this is in book 6 of the Aeneid. It's never realized in the Roman story until Christ. So it's this really powerful thing, and it was so powerful that many people in the Middle Ages believed that, maybe Virgil was a secret Christian, and then they sort of rejected that idea, but they still.
Now I'm pulling up the book Planet Narnia, because that's not the cover I prefer. This is the better cover. No, too bad. So I'm pulling up the book Planet Narnia because one of the things that's interesting in this book is that you see Lewis. I mean, Lewis, of course, was an expert at these stories, and he's playing with them. And of course, this is Michael Ward's quite compelling attempt to make sense of Lewis's Narnia Chronicles, why 7? And there'd been a lot of efforts to sort of figure out, well, what was Lewis doing? Well, dude was a medieval scholar, and in some ways, I mean, he didn't have Harry Potter as a kid to sort of play with, and so as an adult, he lives into this world, and he lives into this world with literature, and the same kinds of things that you hear Pageau and Rohlin talking about is what Lewis just keeps playing with in his stuff. It's really quite fascinating.
Still wanted Virgil to be part of the Christian story, and of course Dante does this in a really beautiful way. But even much later on, Charles Williams has this. He's one of the Inklings, and he's my least favorite Inkling because he's into some not great stuff a lot of the times. But he does have this. He's really into the occult and kind of went down some bad roads by the end of his life. But he does have this one poem in his. He has a cycle of Arthurian poetry called Taliesin through Logres, and in that he actually has this idea that the Welsh bard Taliesin, who is a Christian, somehow by participation sort of like goes into hell or back in time. It's a little ambiguous, and actually like is able to save Virgil like as he's falling into the abyss, right? So there's this so it's people thought, and not just in that not just in the Aeneid, but some of Virgil's other poetry, they saw all of these sort of foreshadowings of Christ.
And I wanted to like take a little pause before we go further to help people understand why this matters and what is going on, because a lot of people might have known a little bit about this or heard it in their different history classes, but it's usually presented as a kind of cheap trick, either as a way, from a Protestant point of view, as this syncretism, and as this kind of return to idolatry, and then from the kind of modern scholar point of view, as a cheap trick that doesn't count, that you should ignore, and that you should just look at the either the more pagan source versions of those stories. Like a good example would be in the Eddas, where even though in the Eddas it's specifically told from a Christian point of view, the scholars today will say, just ignore that. Yeah. Just look at, just go beyond that. And what's really important is that this is talking about the ancient gods. But the process of trying to integrate the past into the new story is something which has so much power and so much.
And again, this is what Pageau was doing, but he's doing the next iteration of it's an attempt at a work of integration.
Much meaning, and it's something that Christ can also do, which is just as Christ baptized Romans, just as Christ baptized Rome into the church, he can do the same for all the ancient stories as well. He can do the same it doesn't mean that everything gets in. it doesn't.
Right.
Some things get in, some things don't, but there is this process by which it has to narratively be connected. So it's not just that we continue to think that these stories exist independently, but we give them a Christian meaning. They actually get connected to the Christian story in the story itself.
So it really sort of all hinges on how real you believe the incarnation is. Like how much of humanity did Christ actually assume in himself? Was it all of it? Does it go all the way back to Adam? Well, if it does, then all of this, like anything that's good in any of this stuff, like it's sort of like it's the deep magic that it works in both directions, and so if you believe, I mean, I've got this, I think I said this on the Areopagus podcast, but I've got this theory that you'll know a society is like really Christianized when it has a specific icon of the Mother of God that's specific to that culture. Like the Poles have the Black Madonna, and the Russians have the Theotokos of Vladimir, and so on. But the reason for that is because she's so deeply connected with the incarnation. And so the more fully Christ becomes incarnate in that culture, right? And obviously he became, from a historical perspective, incarnate in one particular place and time. But it's that particularity that the universality, we could say the Catholicity of the faith actually depends on.
Yeah, it becomes like a fulcrum, like an axis around, exactly. And everything else
sort of
slowly connected.
Sort of like a cross shape.
I don't know.
I don't know.
I don't know where we get that idea.
I don't know.
All right, so I think that we kind of got them. So the idea is that when we say that everybody comes from Troy, so like that we'll go through fast so people can get a sense. Like the Germans, the Scandinavians end up seeing the gods as being a rescue from Troy.
Yeah. So in Snorri's Edda, which is basically this, it's actually a manual for poets that he writes. It's not intended to be like, here's systematic theology for Norse pagans. Which is how people use it, which is crazy. It's nuts. But he actually begins it with a story called Gylfaginning, which is this what scholars today would call a euhemerise, which is a nice way of saying, oh, these pagan gods were actually human beings a long time ago, and then people started worshiping them. And by the way, if you think that story is let's say in conflict with the idea that the gods of the nations are demons, you're not understanding the story, because those things are not opposed. But that's a different story for another time. So but in Gylfaginning, what we see is we get the real story, right? The real story of the Old Norse gods, and the story of the Norse gods. And by the way, the Aesir, the what we normally think of when we think of the Norse gods, Odin and Thor and all those guys, right? They're not Scandinavian originally. They're not. We know that they're not. We know that those gods were imported from somewhere else and they took over. And
now what's interesting about that little package right there is what he did was, in some ways, he just, imagine we're sitting here talking mythish. We're talking mythish. And what he did was he just slipped out and said, okay, now I'm going to talk modernish. Well, we know that these came from a different place. Well, how do you know that? Well, this is all the fruit of the kind of modern scholarship that I feel a little uncomfortable with and is kind of fruitless and kind of, it's sort of a gelding. But we sort of drop into it because we have it available to us. Then we're going to snap back into it again.
So that story is explained as saying these were Trojan kings and, people from Trojan lands, the lands around Troy, who after they were defeated by the Greeks, they migrated north and they took over. So, and
that doesn't contradict at all the idea that the principalities that all of this would be happening at different levels at the same time, right?
And so then here, now Pageau drops back into explainer mode, and we're going to access sort of the New Testament terminology, which, a Baptist can get a handle on.
Right, that all of this is going on at the same time. And so it's mostly to help people understand that that even the neo-pagans, like all of you neo-pagans that are watching, like the people who wrote, hello there, the people who wrote those stories were trying to connect this to the universal story, even though you'd think that there's no relationship between Scandinavians and the Romans. There was this desire to join together and to have this universal story.
So can we maybe?
And it's so interesting because I was thinking about, so the rest is history. The podcast with Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook doesn't major in this kind of stuff, but some of it gets tipped. You know, the strange relationship between Nazism and Nordic, all things Nordic. You know, you look at a German, and well, in many ways, this Nazi idealized person is more Nordic than Nazi. Well, what's going on with that? And you have the Third Reich. What's going on with that? And so these things just keep getting recycled. And well, why do people play with these images and these mythologies, even just below the surface? It's because they work. And well, why do they work? And it isn't just, you know, again, back to the apostle of purpose here. It isn't just that they are connected into other stories, but that these stories themselves are articulating something.
Maybe in the time that's left to us, can we do my favorite one?
Let's go, because this is the key. It's like the relationship between King Arthur and Byzantium. Like, that's how deep this connection is.
Yeah. So let me talk. And
this is why after the first time I watched it, I went on Twitter and I said, you know, I want to see Tom Holland do a commentary on this video, because again, the Arthurian legend. I mean, Tom Holland just has a lot of this history that he has processed.
We won't actually get into Arthur today, but we'll just
but it's like it's the source of all that.
Yeah, so we'll set up a teaser and then we'll get into that. So this is all from the History of the Kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth, and
which is discounted by scholars completely.
Right.
Discounted.
Yeah, completely discounted by scholars. Right. So the way that it starts out is that the island of Britain, and this is for
Jonathan Pageau, is a iconoclast of modernity. There's another thing that we can put in his crest. He is not only the apostle of purpose, he is an iconoclast of modernity.
For all my Lord of Spirits friends out there. Okay, so the island of Britain was believed to have been inhabited by a giant clan, the giant clan of Albion, or so Albion is an ancient name for the island of Britain. So Albion, in a sense, were descended from essentially this Greek princess. Now, keep in mind that she's Greek, so she's from, at least in relation to Britain, she's from the East. This Greek princess who she's betrayed by her sisters who want to kill their husbands so that they can rule over their kingdoms without being subservient to men. That's going to be important later when we talk about Arthur. And so the princess in question didn't want to comply with the plot, so she and her ladies, they get set adrift. And they land on the island of Britain, and there are no men there for them to marry. And so they end up interbreeding with evil spirits, incubi, right? And they beget a race of giants. Now, of course, if you've been listening to Lord of Spirits podcast, you will know that this is how you get giants. And I just want to point out that this version of the story survives all the way into a 14th century text. So it's not like the idea, like the Nephilim ritual or the idea of where giants come from. It was never totally lost, especially out here on what we could call like sort of the edges of Roman civilization, where contacts with paganism were sort of ongoing. So these giants, Albion and his sons, they rule over the island of Britain until the coming of the Trojan exile Brutus. And Brutus is, kind of depending on the version of the story, he's either the grandson or the great-grandson of Aeneas. And therefore, he's related to the Roman royal family. He's part of the Roman story. So Brutus has a journey, which actually kind of recapitulates the journey of Odysseus and Aeneas. He has a stopover in Africa. He has a bunch of battles. He has an encounter with the Sirens. He actually founds the city of, forgive me if I say this wrong, Tours in France. Mm-hmm. And he passes by a bunch of other legendary locations until he eventually reaches the island of Albion, which is totally unpeopled except for the remainders of this giant clan. And basically, the last the ruler of the giants. There's only about 20 giants left, but the ruler of them is a giant known as Gog Magog, as in Gog and Magog, right? And Gog Magog attacks Brutus's camp, and the giants are defeated, and Gog Magog is killed in a wrestling match with one of Brutus's men, Quirinius, who goes on to found the kingdom of Cornwall, which is actually also a really important element in the Arthurian story. And I'll just again put this out there, that the way that Quirinius kills Gog Magog is that he heaves him up onto his shoulders and throws him off a cliff and into the sea. So Gog and Magog are the giant, the Nephilim, whatever you want to call them. They're removed from the kingdom by being banished to the abyss, which is actually the same way that Christ gets rid of the demons, sends them into the pigs. Like we read the gospel like 3 times a year liturgically in the Orthodox Church. Like it's like a disproportionately read story, but the reason is because it's this powerful story of the defeat of these demonic powers, of these giants.
Yeah, we need to remind people that in the Alexander legend, yes, Gog and Magog are not a giant per se, but they're like a race of monsters, a race of kind of cannibalistic, insane creatures, and they get shut out of civilization by being, there's these gates that are built, and they get thrown behind those gates, and they're supposed to stay there until the end of the world, when they will be let loose and onto the world. Yeah.
Yes. So with the giants banished, Brutus establishes the kingdom of Britain, right? And so the legendary history that Geoffrey of Monmouth lays out traces this line of Trojan British rulers in all of the ways and times that it intersects with the Roman Empire. Of course, we'll remember that, Julius Caesar invaded the island of Britain, so did Claudius Nero. So we see these Trojans intersecting and fighting with the Roman Empire, who we must remember the Romans are also Trojans.
Yeah.
So it's a very complicated narrative that he lays out. It's multiple chapters, and I won't try to summarize it here, but essentially to say it's this complicated narrative of conflicting principalities. And ultimately, the way that the conflict is resolved is by a marriage alliance between a British king and a Roman princess. And this line ultimately produces, among other people, the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great.
And that's something that people always have to remember, that Constantine comes from Britain. Like this is not like, now we're not in the legendary history anymore. Yeah. This is like, everybody knows Constantine comes from Britain. This is part of the universal story of Christianity here.
Yeah, so even if he wasn't born in Britain, St. Constantine is indeed, he's very British, according to just your boring old history books, right? He's first acclaimed emperor by the Roman legions in York.
Britain. Yeah.
And I just have to point out here, though, that his mother, Helen, she was claimed to be, depending on the medieval source, either a native of Anatolia, which is where Troy was, or and she was and therefore and a Greek, or Britain in antiquity in the Middle Ages. And it should be clear enough by now, if you've been paying attention, that these two origins for St. Helen, they're not mutually exclusive. They're actually polyvalent. To say that she's from Troy, and by the way, her name is Helen. Okay?
Yeah.
So like, you can't make this stuff up. Like, to say that she's a Greek from the area of Troy, which Helen was a Greek and then taken to Troy, right? So to say that she's a Greek from the area of Troy, or to say that she's part of this Trojan remnant in the British Isles, that's those things are really close. And so they're polyvalent. They're not totally the same, but they have overlapping senses of meaning. And so then what we see is that in the same way that she, Helen is, instead of a divider like Helen of Troy was, or Helen of Sparta, instead of being a divider, Saint Helen she's a uniter, right? And so what she's able to do is she's able to.
Tim Keller would say she's the new and better Helen.
and she's a very important feminine figure in Christianity, especially in the Orthodox Church, right?
You could say she heals Helen of Troy. Like she's
she exactly like and what she does is, and of course then like Saint Olga, right, in baptism, her baptismal name was Helen, right? So it's almost like if you're going to have a woman to fill this role, she has to be named Helen. Just like so maybe a way to think about it is this, we have this idea of the Virgin Mary is the new Eve, right? But within Christianity, there's also the idea of Saint Helen and then Saint Olga as the new Helen of Troy.
Yeah. And right? You could say, and it's a beautiful parallel.
Right. Because she completely undoes, like you could say the Trojan War is like the first hard divide between sort of East and West. Right. And then what Saint Helen does is she actually heals those things. She brings them together. So she's either an Eastern person or she's a Trojan. But either way, she's the one who is able to communicate Christianity to her son. And then what Constantine does, I mean, this is crazy if you think about this. So Constantine goes to found his famous city, Constantinople, within just a few miles of the ruins of Troy.
Where does he found his city? It's amazing.
Yeah, within a few miles of the ruins of the city of Troy. So you've got Constantinople, which is also called New Rome. And if you read Geoffrey of Monmouth, he'll tell you that the original name of London in the universal history, the original name of London is New Troy. So you've got movement from east to west.
He drops the book.
Troy to New Troy, and then movement from west to east, Rome, which is Troy, to New Rome, which is at the location of Old Troy. So there's this cross, and of course, obviously, the story of the cross is obviously super important to Constantine's story.
Yeah,
but it's so important that it's actually embedded in the basic shape of his narrative. There's this X-shaped, cross-shaped movement in the development of Roman history and Western civilization. You have exiles from Troy move west to found a new Troy, which is either Alba Longa, which eventually becomes Rome, or it's London, New Troy. Either way, that's the same story. And then you have a king from New Troy. Constantine is a Roman emperor, but he's also from Britain, moving east to the ruins of Old Troy to found the new Rome, which is Constantinople, which becomes the first Christian city. There are no pagan temples in Constantinople, right? But in doing that, he takes this thing that started back with Alexander, right? This merging together of the Hellenic and the Hebrew narratives. Which didn't always go smoothly. There's this whole thing called the Maccabees, if you read about that. But it didn't always go smoothly. But then what Constantine does, but it didn't go smoothly because Christ had not yet entered the picture. He was hidden, hidden down in sort of the roots of history, but he hadn't yet emerged, right? The stump, and I mean, this is literally the language of the Bible. The stump of Jesse had been cut down, and it had not yet sprung up again.
Yeah.
And so when it springs up, that creates the potential, right? That creates the potential for the Hellenic and the Judaic stories, or the Roman, Greco-Roman, and the Jewish stories to actually merge. And so when the people that we grew up around, or people out there on the internet say, "Oh, Constantine introduced all this paganism into the church," right? They're not right. But they're also right in a way that they don't realize they're right.
They don't understand.
They just don't understand that actually Constantine's merging of these things was, first of all, it's the only way it could have gone, right? It's the fulfillment of just, it's the cross.
Yeah.
Which makes it very interesting to ask, okay, so now, again, so if you're a Protestant, and both these guys know this, Constantine is the baddie. Why is Constantine the baddie? Well, because Constantine weds Christianity and politics. Okay. As if, I don't know, management of Massachusetts, New Haven, Connecticut, Geneva, Zurich. Europe was doing that all over the place. And so there's so much to think through here, and I found this video just astoundingly informative and insightful, and it just lit up a bunch of things in my mind. Still does.
Right.
And also the few things to understand is that Britain, what's suggested in the story of Britain and even the reality of Britain is that it was considered the end of the world. Right. It was considered the edge of the world, which is why the Romans were constantly trying to build walls out there to stop these insane, like crazy naked barbarians from like flooding into the world. So just like Alexander built a wall, you know, at the Caspian Sea, then the emperors built. There were two walls. There were two Maginot Lines that the Hadrian's Wall and what's the name of the other wall? And Antonine Wall. So there are two walls that the Romans built out there in Britain to like stop these insane barbarians from propping in. So it was understood as the western edge of civilization. I know Anatolia and Troy was the beginning of this whole story in the first place. And so Constantine joins them together, right, through Rome itself. And so it's like you have the middle, the edge, and the other edge, like the beginning, this middle part, and then the other edge, and all kind of brought together into one story. So
that goes back to, and by the way, I know you're a francophone because you said Maginot Line, which is like that. It would never occur to an Anglo.
How would you say it?
Well, we would just say like a wall, like you know, like we don't go to the Maginot Line as, oh yeah, that's a good way to explain this. But anyway, I just love it.
Maginot Line didn't work.
And
then Constantine. So Constantine's actual, like even the history of Constantine, which is still preserved by a modern historian, still has so much mythical in it.
Yeah.
And so the fact that Constantine wins his battle on a bridge is all about that. Right. It's all about this. And if you read the descriptions of the battle of Milvian Bridge, you get this sense that he's like the new Moses. He's crossing the Red Sea. He's crossing the flood. All this imagery of like a transition between two worlds, as this kind of, and also as kind of bringing together these opposites, like this new world that will join all of this together, is there like right in his own story.
And that's the same. A few minutes ago we were talking about the joining of history and apocalypse. Right, the beginning of a thing and the end of the thing. Right, that's what Constantine is doing. Right, he's joining the beginning and the end. And what does he join them with? He joins them with the cross.
Yeah, and so I think
Constantine fixed everything. I just have to say that on the internet so it's recorded.
Just keep saying that Constantine
fixed everything.
Well, let's just say Christ fixed everything.
Yes,
and then Constantine participated in like the fruits of that and manifested like the hidden fruits that were there from the cross.
Yes.
And so I think, so we'll stop there, but just to kind of give people a hint of where this goes is that you have to remember that Arthur is not, the idea that Arthur is like this like a Celtic pagan figure is absolute nonsense. Like Arthur is a descendant of these people. He's a descendant of these Trojans that are in Britain. And so all of this is going to help you understand how this universal story then continues and how Britain itself plays such an important part because of this, because of how it is the edge of the world, because of how it was the place out of which Constantine came to bridge everything together, and how this is really is a mythical story laying itself out. And so I hope you guys are, like, I struggle to think you could be as excited about as us about this story. But
very excited. There's a lot of videos of Pageau's that I really like, and I watched this the first time, and it was just like bang.
What we hope is we want to start to bring this into the fore of your consciousness, so that you can see that these connections are not arbitrary, and that
the apostle of purpose.
Even though we don't have to give up completely a more critical historical approach, we don't have to give that up, but we need to be.
This is exactly what he's doing.
Be able to see these connections as extremely meaningful and based on meaning and on identities of these people and how they saw themselves, right? And so sometimes it's not necessarily even positive, like the fact that the example that I gave of the Hungarians or the Scandinavians who saw themselves as a monstrous son of Noah, it's not just about boasting and about making your people to be the best. And it really is about a piercing into the mystery of the light and dark sides of your own people.
It's not about putting yourself necessarily at the center of the story. It's about finding your place in the story. And this is a huge difficulty for egalitarian people, accepting yourself where you are in the story. And again, this is the Apostle of Purpose's hierarchy, that you have a place in the hierarchy. And the place that you have is your place, and it's your proper place. And again, Lewis had a real sense of this. So,
and seeing how this all connects together into this giant puzzle. So
yeah.
So I'm hoping you guys are excited about this, because I really want us to kind of move on to both East and West. We'll talk about Arthur. We'll talk about the Byzantine prophecies and the Byzantine notion of the coming emperor, like the hidden and coming emperor that is similar to Arthur.
And we're going to talk about Ethiopia as well.
Definitely, we need to talk about Ethiopia.
Yeah.
Oh, I can't be more excited for their next conversation. And I have to get home, and I've got a Bible study tonight. So, but I wanted to, I couldn't make a third video on this, but I can't wait until their next episode. Thanks for watching.